Hey, this is Benjamin Boyce. How you doing? I can't hear you, so I'm just going to continue with my thing. Hope you're doing well. So this tweet is circulating from the United Nations, and it reads, "The COVID-19 pandemic is demonstrating what we all know. Millennia of patriarchy have resulted in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture, which damages everyone: women, men, girls, and boys." That tweet was rather incendiary, and so it was picked up. A lot of people are like bashing on the UN for bashing on patriarchy, bashing on men, but there's other things that are going on within this Secretary General's statement. I just want to read a portion of his statement, and you can find the link to the full statement in the description below, because it's not just being anti-men directly by blaming men for everything bad in the world. Their solution is actually kind of problematic to me, so let's read this. Distinguished activists, protecting the rights of women and girls during this time is a top priority for the United Nations. We issued a policy brief in early April calling on governments to take concrete action to put women and girls, their inclusion, representation, rights, social and economic outcomes, and protection at the center of all efforts to tackle and recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. The first phase is the health response. So the first problem I have with that is that they do, instead of tackling COVID-19, they divide humanity up into, the sexes, girls and boys, and men and women. And then they're like, well, we need to take care of women most, right? Which I don't think is necessarily helpful. You should be tackling COVID-19. Like, this is an opportunity for us to set aside our identity differences and tackle a common problem, but they are already splitting up the populace in order to shuffle resources around towards something that doesn't necessarily have to do with the actual pandemic. To continue, while statistics indicate that women and girls are at lower risk from COVID-19 virus itself, they are suffering because of the redirection of health funding and services. It is simply counterproductive, for example, to deprioritize maternal and reproductive health services. Maternal mortality fell by nearly 40% between 2000 and 2017. We cannot draw back now, but there are signs that rates are rising again due to the pandemic, particularly in countries in crisis. Now, he opens with the fact that COVID-19 itself actually affects men more, but because it affects men more, money is going away from women to support men. He's criticizing the prioritization of this pandemic for being a priority, because that priority is deprioritizing other things that he is championing. Governments must take a holistic view of the health impact of this pandemic. All women have a right to quality, affordable sexual and reproductive health services. Governments have a responsibility to make sure women and girls can access these services, even during a crisis. In the longer term, we need health systems that meet the needs and realities of all, including women and girls. The whole thrust of this is that especially women and girls. And I'm making this argument not to denigrate the needs of women and girls. I'm not making an argument that women and girls should be left out in the cold. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the ways in which activism contorts every issue to get what it wants is kind of the issue that I have with it. And that is another trick of activism, that if you critique their ways of getting what they want, they will say that you are for what they are against. Basically, that I am for the marginalization of women just because I am critiquing their ways in which to continually prioritize what they want at the end of the day. To continue. We are also urging governments to prioritize protecting women from gender-based violence in their national COVID-19 plans. At the start of the pandemic, after my call for a global ceasefire, I issued an appeal for an end to all violence everywhere, from war zones to people's homes, so that we can face this pandemic together in solidarity. That sentence alone should tell you that this is all a bunch of bullshit. He called for a ceasefire of all violence everywhere. What's going to happen at the end of the pandemic? He's going to say, okay, you guys can go back to being violent again. Like, this guy has no power over violence, right? And it's kind of ridiculous that he would just, stand on a podium. I declare it is peacetime, right? It's like, what are you talking about, dude?
I declare bankruptcy!
There is an issue, actually, if you think about it, with regards to the lockdown. If, let's say, a woman and her children are stuck inside with an abusive partner, like, where does that woman go? She's not allowed to go anywhere because of the lockdown. So there is actually an issue there that I don't mean to denigrate. So he stood on his pedestal and issued an appeal for an end to all violence everywhere. And then to continue. The second phase of this response is mitigating the social and economic impact of this crisis. That starts with putting money into the hands of women who work in both the formal and informal economies. Cash transfers, credits, and loans should be targeted at women to mitigate the immediate impact of job losses and increased caring responsibilities. As governments inject stimulus and other funds to get their economies back to work, they must expand social safety nets and recognize the value of invisible and unpaid care work. This will address the vulnerabilities women experience, ensure women's central role in economic life, and in the long term, contribute to sustainable development and more inclusive and resilient economies. So this is my idea, and I think that there's several ways to argue for or against this idea. But if the government's there to provide for the woman, what is the use of the man anymore? If the government takes the role of the provider, then the woman becomes basically a ward of the state. Secondly, the idea of invisible and unpaid care work is interesting, right? The labor that is not given a monetary value, let's say taking care of children or taking care of the elderly, that's not paid directly. That's something that you just volunteer for, and you're not remunerated for it by the baby or the elderly. Maybe the elderly provided you enough of a nest egg to take care of them, but this guy is saying that the government should step in and pay women to do that unpaid work. That might be shifting around the economy where you're just going to be taxing men going out and making value in the world in the capitalist marketplace. The men go out, they get the job, you tax the men, and then you funnel the money that the men make through a government apparatus and give it to the women, instead of the men and the women figuring out for themselves by various levels of mating and constructing a marriage and a family and all the social rules involved in causing a man and a woman, or causing a man to dedicate himself to his family. Instead of fostering that, you're eroding the bond of the family and inserting the government into there. That's the problem that I have with this. But I could see that there are arguments for unpaid work, unpaid labor, and stuff like that. And how do you actually solve that problem? If you make it a problem like that, then I basically think you're going to institute a government apparatus, which is just a bunch of people leeching off the money that the man is making and giving it to the woman, instead of the man and the woman through a relationship, bartering that out on their own. To continue, the third phase of the response is building a better future. The pandemic is only demonstrating what we all know, that millennia of patriarchy have resulted in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture, which damages everyone: women, men, girls, and boys. The guy doesn't go on to explain what he means by this. He's just saying patriarchy is this big, bad problem, and it damages everyone. And so we are going to somehow solve that by making a bureaucracy that's going to take over the patriarchy somehow, right? I mean, it's needlessly divisive. In a time of crisis, this guy is causing more tensions to occur and delegitimizing the United Nations as some organization that people can trust, because they hate men. To continue, I have many times said that behind many of the problems I've been talking about, there is an essential question of power. It is indeed addressing this question of power that we must concentrate all our efforts. So that really shows that this guy's a power-hungry bureaucrat. He's going to criticize the power relationships in the world in order to get power for himself or his own institution. But he doesn't go on and define what he means by power, other than representation, I suppose. To continue, it is clear that we cannot go back to the failed policies that have resulted in the fragility we see around us in healthcare systems, in social protection, in access to justice. This is the time to rebuild more equal, inclusive, and resilient societies. Our roadmap is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We need to take the opportunity of an economic reset to ensure the rights of life, dignity, and security for everyone. Now, I'm not saying that they planned this economic reset, but they are taking advantage of it to recreate the world in their image. And basically, the only solution that he has is more government. He wants to insert the government into the traditional role of the man and make everybody a ward of the state. That's basically the power play here. To continue, the pandemic has shown us who is doing the work that really matters. Nurses, teachers, care workers. As we recover, we need to remember this. It is time to end the inequities of unpaid care work and create new economic models that work for everyone. So he says that the people who really matter are nurses, teachers, and care workers. What about the people who run the sewage? What about the people who are picking up the trash during the pandemic? What about the people who are keeping our electricity, our lights going? What about all of the male laborers out there, doing that hard labor? They are not essential. He's pandering to the females and what female typical work is, and leaving out the males. He's disenfranchising the males from this government from the outset because the males will resist it. That's what I'm thinking. The men don't want you to take away from them to give to the women. They want to give to the women themselves in exchange for, the children and, a relationship and, all the things that are connected to that relationship. But now the government wants to be involved in that, and men will resist that. So from the outset, I think he's just kind of disenfranchising the men. Benefits like health insurance, paid sick leave, paid child and family care, and paid parental leave are not luxuries. They are vital to the functioning of our societies. Extending those inevitably has a gender dimension because so much of the work women do is underpaid and undervalued. I'm sure that I could be presented with an argument where I'll agree to that, but my contention is, how are you going to fix that? Is government the answer? To continue, recovering better goes beyond governments. Wow. The private sector, academia, what do you guys want? Academia or academia? Whatever. Institutions of all kinds and civil society must be fully engaged. Again, this is evidence that the government is not content with dealing with itself. It wants to extend itself into every single sector. It is essential to protect and expand civic space, so that civil society organizations can play their full part. We must also emerge from this crisis with women's equal leadership and representation. And then he talks about how he achieved gender parity with 90 women and 90 men as full-time senior leaders. So he wants equality of men and women in all the leadership positions. Like, this is very top-down, this is very hierarchical, top-down. We're going to solve the problems of inequality by mathematically looking at everything as men and women and then just achieving parity. But he doesn't know what's lying in the wings of that is men identifying into the role of females in order to, eat up, a little bit of loss of dignity, but you get your power. To be rather cynical with regards to the ways in which gender theory or queer theory can be gamed to gain that, equal distribution of power between men and women. Organizations and companies that include equal numbers of women at all levels are more effective, efficient, and resilient to sudden shocks. Hold on, maybe I should get in contact with my female side just so I could be more resilient to sudden shocks as a one-man show? I don't know. What about companies that are run solely by women, right? Do they count? No. Really, again, it's all about status. It's all about power. If he can be the one to distribute status to the women, he becomes the breadwinner. His government becomes the breadwinner. This is like a play to be the king of the pride, basically. If you look at the guy himself, he's not that attractive, so it would have to be bureaucracy that would get him to where he is. going. To wrap up, this is also why I've made temporary special measures a signature issue of my call to action on human rights. Unless we use quotas and temporary special measures, those are quotes I'm putting in the air right here, temporary special measures to remove the biases and obstacles to women's equal participation, women will never realize their full rights, and societies will never reap the benefits of equality and inclusion. Okay, there's a couple things here. I know that feminists who would be watching this would be in favor of the government doing what it can to decrease biases and to give you a leg up in the economy. But inherent in that is this consideration that women can't do anything without the government's help. Women will never realize their full rights unless there is a governmental intervention. The whole thrust of this is that government is still the patriarchy, but the men in your life will have a barrier between you and them. Instead of being able to negotiate with the man in your life or with the men in your life or with the systems that you encounter in your life, you appeal to the government, and the government distributes your power and your wealth and your resources to you. You therefore become reliant not on yourself, but on the government that has paved the way for you. And one more thing. Unless we use quotas and temporary special measures, I'm really, that's really dicey to me. Temporary special measures. We want unilateral authority for a short time until we get what we want. And then, of course, we'll relinquish that temporary power. We said it was temporary. That never happens. These institutions never, once an institution gains power, it never lets it go. Or it does everything it can, always, to expand. That's what it's about. And so, a lot of people are critiquing it for being man-battering. I think that's the least of the worries, right? That's the flashy thing. Oh, look, they hate patriarchy. They blame everything on men and women. That's not the real issue. The real issue is that this organization wants to control everything. And this is an appeal for power to be the arbiters of reality and resources and status. So that is my issue with it. But there are definite true, real issues for women and girls in this time and all times. And I think that there is definitely a place for organizations to help women, to keep them safe and to get them out of trouble, or to, cater to their needs in terms of sexual health and maternal things, right? Because that labor of creating the baby is something that is quite burdensome, and we could all help that process in order to maintain a rich, flourishing world filled with healthy human beings who have the proper care. So I'm for that. I'm not for a bureaucracy that's using division to get its way and then promising itself, saying the patriarchy's bad, but we're going to replace it with everything that the patriarchy is. And we're just not going to call it patriarchy because the patriarchy's bad, but we're still going to provide for you and tell you what you are and make you reliant on us for everything you need. So it's just dicey bureaucracy. And I have no problems railing against bureaucracy. I like to do that. That's actually a fun pastime for me. So I'm going to get on to go to a gun range now. I hope you guys are safe and careful and cool and calm and collected, and I'll check back in with you at a later time. Goodbye.